A mountain so cold and so old it has no patience for people who don't mean what they say. A barn full of lanterns. A woman standing alone against the wall. 7 men have already walked away. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't cry. She just stands there with work-scarred hands and eyes that have stopped asking for anything from anyone. Then the doors blow open. Snow, a man the size of a storm. Silver that hits the floor with the sound of something serious. He looks past every woman in the room and stops at her, not at her face, at her hands. What happens next will cost her everything she thought she knew about what she was worth, and give her something no one in that barn could have predicted. The mirror was cracked. Had been for 2 years. Right down the middle, the fracture running from the upper left corner to the lower right, splitting her reflection into 2 slightly misaligned halves that never quite agreed on what they were showing her. Maren Voss had stopped noticing it. That was probably something. She stood in the back room of the cabin and pressed the last pin into her hair and looked at the woman in the broken glass. 25 years old. Dark hair that behaved when she asked it to. Eyes the color of creek water in October brown, but not simply brown. Cheekbones her mother had called fine, and her father hadn't noticed since her mother died. The dress was clean. She'd boiled it twice and ironed it with the flat iron she heated on the cook stove, and it was 3 years old, and the fabric had thinned at the elbows, but you wouldn't see that unless you were looking for something to find. People would be looking. They always were. From the main room she heard it. The silence that followed a long swallow. The clink of glass on wood. Her father was already drinking, which meant he'd been drinking since mid-afternoon, which meant he was going to be charming and embarrassing at the gathering in equal measure, which meant she was going to spend the evening managing him alongside everything else she was going to spend the evening managing. She picked up her coat, mended at the collar, missing one button on the left side that she kept meaning to replace and kept not replacing because there were always 17 other things that needed doing first. She put it on. This was the 8th year. 8 years of November gatherings in Ferris Belford's barn, and she still couldn't decide if coming was brave or just stubborn. Maybe they were the same thing. Maybe she'd stopped being able to tell the difference. She was almost to the door when she heard Prue Mather's voice outside. 3 quick knocks, then Maren, before you go. For you. Prue was 52 years old and had been a widow for 11 of them, and she was the only person in Crow Hollow who talked to Maren like she was a complete human being, rather than an ongoing situation requiring management. Which was why, when Maren opened the door and saw the look on Prue's face, she didn't say anything. She just waited. Prue held out an envelope. "Your sister sent this 6 months ago," she said. "She asked me to hold it, said to give it to you when—" She paused. "She said you'd know when." Maren looked at the envelope. Clara's handwriting on the front. Clear and slanting the way their mother had taught them both. The return address was a town in Kansas she'd never been to. 6 months, Maren said. "She knew your father opens the mail before you get home." Prue said it without judgment, just a fact. She said it wasn't something he should read first. Maren took the envelope and put it in her coat pocket without opening it. "After," she said. Prue nodded. "After." Then she stepped back and Maren walked out into the November dark, and the cold of Wyoming in late autumn hit her face like a hand that had been waiting. The barn smelled the way it always smelled. Wood smoke and bodies and mold cider and the animal warmth of too many people in an enclosed space pretending they were there for the music. They weren't there for the music. Everyone in Crow Hollow understood what the November gathering actually was. The territory was still young enough that eligible women were scarce. Winters were brutal enough that men without wives didn't manage them well. So every November, before the worst cold came down from the mountains, the unmarried sorted themselves out in Ferris Belford's barn while the community watched and quietly decided who belonged with whom. Maren had understood this since she was 17, had watched her sister Clara get chosen by a farmer from the valley when they were both still young enough to think it was romantic, had watched Clara ride away to solid walls and a husband who didn't drink, and had written twice a year ever since her letters growing warmer and more settled as the years accumulated. Had come back here every November since, had never been chosen. The fiddle player was working through something fast and cheerful that nobody was actually listening to. Lanterns hung from the rafters and swayed in the drafts, throwing warm, unsteady light across the faces below. Marin found her position along the far wall, not hiding, not centered, and waited. The first man was called Horace, a farmer from the South Valley with a square jaw and hands that had done real work which she respected. He approached around 8 o'clock with his hat in both hands, and the expression of a man executing a plan he'd already thought through and didn't particularly enjoy. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Horace." He looked at a point just past her left shoulder. "Your father's place, up on Settlers Road." "That's right." A slow nod, like he was confirming what he'd expected. "I heard he's had some trouble with the card games." Marin kept her smile where it was. "Everyone's had trouble this winter. The thing is," he stopped, started again. The apologetic shift in his voice was already happening, and she hated it before it arrived. "I've got a good operation, 160 acres solid cabin, new well dug last spring. I need someone who can bring something to the partnership." He looked at her now just briefly. "You understand." She understood completely. She'd understood it before he opened his mouth. "Completely," she said. "Thank you for being direct." He put his hat back on and walked away. The second man lasted 4 minutes. The third was a stranger from the Northern Territories who talked about soil composition for most of those minutes before quietly mentioning that he'd heard some things about her family's situation and needed someone with resources. The fourth man spoke to her father across the room for 3 minutes, looked at her once, and turned away without crossing the floor. By the time the fifth man arrived, Marin had stopped counting the minutes. The fifth man was Kip Belford, who was 20 years old and whose father owned this barn and most of the mortgages in Crow Hollow. He was spotty-faced and held himself with the confidence of a young man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He looked at Marin the way you look at a piece of merchandise you've decided isn't worth the asking price. He didn't say a word, just looked and moved on. Someone laughed, low, quickly smothered, from somewhere to her left. That was the thing that moved inside her, not the rejections themselves. She'd built up calluses against those over 8 years, a surface that they hit without going too deep. But that sound, that small, bitten-back sound of someone finding entertainment in her standing here. She straightened her back. She lifted her chin. She walked deliberately toward the cider table with the kind of controlled pace that said she was going there because she wanted cider, not because she was removing herself from anyone's sightline. She had almost reached it when she heard the voices. 2 women. The careful whisper of people who want to be overheard without technically being overheard. Can't imagine why she keeps coming. Everyone knows by now her father owes money to half the county. Who'd want to take that on? And she's not exactly, she's pleasant looking, but she's so severe. Never smiles right. Always staring at things like she's annoyed at them. A pause. "Clara got out at the right time, didn't she? Before the family really—" Marin poured herself cider with a steady hand. Her face felt like stone. Not cold stone, just stone. Dense and settled and not particularly interested in what the air around it thought. She took a long drink and stared at the lantern above the cider table and told herself every minute that passes is 1 minute closer to leaving. And then she took a step toward the east wall and stopped. Because something had happened to the barn. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. The fiddle had stopped. The conversations had stopped. The ambient noise of 60 people talking and laughing and pretending to care about harvest celebrations had just ceased. And then the doors blew open. Not opened, blew open. Both panels slamming back against the barn walls hard enough that the lanterns shuddered on their hooks and set every shadow in the room swinging. The cold came through like something alive, a wave of winter air with a specific destination, and it found the hollow places in every coat and collar it touched. Several women gasped. Men reached for things that weren't there. In the doorway stood something that Marin's mind took a moment to process correctly. Large. That was the first impression, and it kept being the impression even after she'd cataloged everything else. The sheer physical scale of him. The way he had to angle his shoulders to come through the door, even with both panels thrown wide. He was covered in snow, not dusted with it, not flecked, but coated from hat brim to boot heel, as if he'd walked through the center of a storm and hadn't bothered to stop walking. Over his left shoulder he carried wolf pelts. gray and silver and winter dark, three of them, at least each large enough to cover a man from shoulder to knee. In his right hand, he held a cloth sack that made a dense metallic sound when he set it on the floor just inside the door. His coat was canvas and leather and had been repaired in so many places by so many different hands over so many years that the original material was almost incidental to what it had become. His face was half shadowed under the brim of a battered hat, and what she could see of it was a jaw dusted with more than intentional stubble, a mouth set in the neutral expression of a man who doesn't perform anything he doesn't mean. His eyes were moving across the room in a slow, systematic way, not looking for the prettiest dress, not looking for the most welcoming smile, reading the room the way you'd read a piece of terrain you just entered and hadn't decided whether to trust yet. Marin recognized him before most people did, not because she knew him personally, because she'd heard the stories. Everybody in Crow Hollow had heard the stories told them, the way you told stories about bears and blizzards and other things that occupied the outer edge of your known world. The man who lived past the timberline, the trapper who came down twice a year to trade and never stayed longer than necessary. The man whose name people said with a specific weight behind it. Cale Rourke. 32, maybe. The mountains did something to faces that had nothing to do with age. Carved them into something more specific, more settled into what they actually were. Ferris Belford had found his voice. He moved forward across the barn floor with his merchant smile and his hands spread wide. Rourke, we weren't expecting you until spring. Got down before the worst of it closed the pass. Rourke's voice was lower than she'd expected. Not loud, not performing itself, just a voice that said what it needed to say and left space around it. Brought 3 gray pelts and 40 pounds of standard, plus this. He nudged the cloth sack with his boot. The metallic sound repeated. Belford's eyes went straight to the sack. What's in raw silver off the North Ridge, 12 pounds? He paused. Don't need to weigh it. I know what it is. The murmur that moved through the crowd was involuntary. 50 people simultaneously recalculating. The word silver did that everywhere, but in a frontier community in November, it did it faster. Rourke had stopped looking at Belford. His eyes were moving across the room again, crossing the clusters of eligible women near the center, the Harmon sisters and the Delacroix girls and half a dozen others moving across them with the calm attention of a man reading a list in a language he doesn't particularly need. Something about his expression remained perfectly still. Not disinterested, not rude, just unmoved the way a man is unmoved by things that aren't relevant to what he's actually looking for. Then his eyes found Marin and stopped. She felt it as a physical thing, the weight of being looked at by someone who is actually looking, not performing interest, not calculating what you represent, just looking, taking inventory of what was actually there. She looked back. She wasn't going to look away. Not tonight. Not after everything that had already happened in the last 2 hours in this barn. She looked back at him with the level attention she'd have given a strange dog on a road. Not hostile, not inviting, just present, waiting to see what it would do. His gaze moved to her hands. She was holding the cider cup with both of them, and she'd never been particularly self-conscious about her hands. They were what they were. The hands of someone who had split firewood and patched roof sections and carried water from the well and done most of the labor of keeping their cabin from collapsing over the last several years. The skin was rough. There were scars from the hatchet and the cook stove and old wire. The knuckles were cracked from cold. She hadn't worn gloves to the gathering because she didn't own a pair worth wearing. He looked at her hands for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his silver sack and walked toward her. The crowd parted, automatically without deciding to. The courtesy that people extend to very large things moving through confined spaces. He didn't seem to notice it happening. He stopped in front of her, 3 feet between them, close enough that she could see his eyes clearly for the first time. Gray-green, the color of river water under overcast sky. They were looking at her the way she hadn't been looked at all evening. Not the way the other men had looked at her. Not assessing her the way you'd assess the condition of a piece of equipment. Something different. Something she couldn't quite name. Like a trail he was thinking about taking. You're Harlow Voss's daughter, he said. Marin, she said. Voss. Rourke. He didn't extend a hand. He was looking at her with that same quality of attention. Steady, not aggressive. Direct in the way that direct and respectful can be the same thing when the person doing it means both. I know who you are, she said. Tell me. She considered lying, being diplomatic, giving him something soft. The evening had beaten the politeness out of her. You live past the timberline, she said, north of where the trails end. You come down twice a year, trade fast and leave faster. You haven't spoken to most people in Crow Hollow in years. She paused. They say you're half wild. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the beginning of the idea of one. Mostly accurate, he said. Around them, the barn had gone quiet in the way it goes quiet when something is happening that everyone wants to watch, but no one wants to be caught watching. Rourke reached into his coat. He produced something and placed it on the cider table beside her without ceremony. A small leather pouch. It made the same dense metallic sound as the larger bag he'd carried in, just quieter. I'm looking for a partner, he said. Marin looked at the pouch, then at him. A partner, she said, for the territory, the cabin, the winter work. He spoke like a man who had rehearsed this and was delivering it plainly without decoration. I've run it alone for 5 years. Summers, that's fine. Winters, he stopped. That stop was interesting. She had the sense that finishing that sentence cost him something. Not emotion exactly, something more structural. The admission that a thing he'd been managing alone had reached the edge of what one person could manage alone. You need a hired hand, she said. No, flat, clean, not unkind but not interested in being misunderstood. There are men in this town who, I'm not talking about a hired hand. He looked at her. I'm talking about someone with a stake in it, someone who stays, someone who can hold the cabin while I work the lines, someone who can do what needs doing without being told twice. He paused. A partner. The word wife hung between them unspoken. Marin looked at this man, this enormous, snow-covered, reportedly half-savage man who had just walked into a barn full of younger women with better prospects and warmer families, and had crossed the room to her, who had looked at her hands before he'd said a single word. Why me, she said. Not a question exactly. A genuine inquiry. She wanted an honest answer and she was going to wait for one. His eyes went to her hands again. Your hands, he said. Everyone in this territory works. Not like that. He met her eyes. You don't look at work like something that happened to you. You look at it like something you decided. He held her gaze. That's different. Marin was quiet. It was possibly the most accurate thing anyone had said about her in years. Said without flattery, without any particular warmth, as a simple observation of a fact he had noted. Coming from a stranger, in a barn, on the worst evening of her year. The mountain is dangerous, she said. Yes. People die up there. Yes. I don't know the first thing about trap lines, or surviving above the timberline. I'll teach you. And then before she could use that as an excuse or a comfort, and if you can't learn fast enough, something moved in his eyes. Not dismissal, not reassurance, just honesty. Then you'll have a very hard winter, but you'll have a hard winter either way. Marin looked around the barn. The politely averted eyes, the small, careful smiles that held something else behind them. Her father across the room with his third cider pretending not to watch. Kip Belford, 20 years old, who had looked at her like a price tag and moved on. She looked back at Rourke. Half, she said. He blinked. First time she'd seen him do it. What? Half of whatever the territory produces. Pelt, silver, whatever else comes off it. I'm not going up there as your cook. She held his gaze. If I'm a partner, I want a partner's share. The barn made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. She watched him process it, weigh it, test it against something she couldn't see. 40%, he said. Half. Another pause, longer this time. And then something settled in his expression. Something that had the quality of a man who has met an unexpected thing and has decided after a moment that unexpected is not the same as wrong. Half, he agreed. Marin set down her cider cup, picked up the leather pouch from the table. Heavier than she'd expected, significantly heavier. She put it in her coat pocket. "When do we leave?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, before light." She nodded once. She did not look at the people around her, did not look for her father, did not allow herself to feel anything except the cold weight of the silver in her pocket and the knowledge that she was making a decision she couldn't take back. That night, she spent an hour packing and 2 hours lying awake, talking herself out of it, and then failing. Her father found her at midnight. He stood in her doorway with the lamp, and in its light, he looked older than his years, the way that certain kinds of grief age a face faster than time has any right to. He looked at her open pack on the floor. "You're going," he said. "Yes." "With Rourke?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then Eleanor. That was her mother's name. He caught it, looked briefly ashamed. "Marin, don't!" He said it quickly. "Don't go, it's not safe." She was not going to be unkind to him. She loved him. She would always love him. But she was also done pretending that their shared life here was something other than what it actually was. "Don't tell me it's not safe," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Because you know what's not safe is spending another winter in this cabin while the roof gets worse and the wood gets low and your tab at the saloon gets longer." She folded a wool blanket, carefully set it in the pack. "Don't tell me you need me here because we both know what that means. And don't—" Her voice held. She made sure of it. "Don't tell me you're worried about me, because if you'd been worried about me, you'd have done something about it before tonight." Her father's face changed. Not broke exactly, settled. Like a structure finally acknowledging the weight it had been pretending it wasn't carrying. "He's not a safe man," Harlow said finally. "Not an argument, just a fact he was offering." "I know," Marin said. She closed the pack. "I've never actually been safe, Papa. I just pretended to be here." He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway for a while longer. Then the lamp went with him back down the hall, and she packed in the dark because she knew every inch of that cabin by feel, which was one of the things that happen when you'd been in a place too long. She took her mother's bone-handled knife from the tin box at the bottom of the trunk where she'd kept it for 10 years. She took the photograph of her and Clara from the summer before Clara married. She took her sewing kit and the wool blanket and the winter underthings she'd been mending since October. Then she remembered the envelope. She found it in her coat pocket, still sealed. She opened it by the light that came through the window from the half-moon outside. Clara's handwriting. Even in familiar, the slope of it exactly what she remembered. "Marin, 8 years. I've been counting. I want you to know I've been counting because I know you never stopped. I know you kept going back because that's what you do. You keep going back, and you keep standing there, and you keep not letting it be the thing that breaks you, which is one of the things I love most about you, and also one of the things that breaks my heart. But here is what I need you to hear. You've been standing in the wrong room. That's not a failure. It's not a character flaw. It's not anything about you except this. You've been waiting for someone to open a door that was never going to open from that side. Wherever you are when you read this, whatever happened tonight, the door is on the other side of the building. Stop waiting to be chosen. Choose." Your loving sister, Clara Marin, sat on the edge of her bed for a while. The moon moved through the window and the cabin was quiet around her, and she thought about 8 years. About what they had cost her and what they had made of her in the spending. About Kip Belford's look and the laughter she'd heard from the corner and her father's lamp going away down the hall. And about a man who had walked into a barn and looked at her hands and said, "You don't look at work like something that happened to you." At 4:30 in this morning, she was standing outside the cabin with her pack over her shoulder and the bone-handled knife in her boot and the silver pouch in her coat pocket. It was very cold, the kind of cold that has opinions. Rourke came down the road at 5 minutes to 5 with 2 horses and a loaded pack mule moving through the dark in the blowing snow like a shadow that had learned to navigate. He looked at her standing there. Pack on, coat buttoned to the throat, breath clouding, eyes open. He gave a single nod. She took the reins of the horse he indicated, a broad-chested gray with a calm eye and the steady disposition of an animal that had been places and decided not to be bothered by it. She put her foot in the stirrup and hauled herself up. "How long is the ride?" she asked. "3 days if the weather holds." She looked north. The sky above the mountains was the gray-black of pre-dawn, heavy with cloud, the peaks invisible somewhere behind it. From somewhere up there, barely audible, came the sound of wind moving through rock at speeds that had nothing to do with the still air down here in the valley. "It won't hold," she said. He glanced at the sky, looked back at her. "No," he agreed. "It won't." He turned his horse north. Marin turned hers to follow. She did not look back at Crow Hollow. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid in the specific and concrete way of someone who knows what she's walking toward rather than what she's running from. But she had Clara's letter in her coat pocket against her chest and the silver pouch in the other pocket. And somewhere in the back of her coat, she carried everything she owned that was worth carrying. And ahead of her, past the tree line where the trails ended and the world became something other than what she'd always known, there was a mountain that had been waiting one way or another for a very long time. She rode into the dark, and the dark received her. The mountain cold was not the same thing as valley cold. This was the first lesson. Not one Rourke taught her explicitly. One the mountain taught her directly without preamble on the first morning after they left Crow Hollow behind. Valley cold was an inconvenience. It bit at your face and made your fingers clumsy and got inside your coat if you stood still too long. But valley cold had a ceiling. You could warm up from it. You could close a door against it, stand near a fire, eat something hot, and come back from it in an hour. Mountain cold had no ceiling. It didn't just go through your coat. It went through your coat and then through the layer beneath, and then through the layer beneath that, and then it started in on the part of you that wasn't made of cloth or skin at all. The part that made decisions, the part that calculated distances and assessed options and said, I can do this or I cannot do this. Mountain cold had opinions about that part especially. She found this out on the second day on a slope that looked manageable from below and revealed itself to be something else entirely from the middle. Her horse was handling it better than she was. Her hands had gone past cold into something that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite numbness, but was both at once. The pack she carried felt heavier than it had at the bottom, and the top of the slope kept being further away than she'd estimated. Rourke had been 20 yards ahead of her, then 15. Then he was beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer a hand or slow down in any visible way. He just adjusted his pace to hers close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, which was its own kind of information about what kind of cold they were in. She didn't ask for the help. He didn't offer it. They just went up the slope together at a pace she could manage, and when they reached the top and the wind hit them from the west, she stood still for a moment and breathed and let her hands find each other inside her pockets. He waited, not impatiently, not with any visible emotion at all, just waited the way a good horse waits with the calm of something that has been in difficult places before, and learned that rushing the recovery doesn't shorten it. After 2 minutes, she said, "All right." He started moving. She followed. That was the shape of the first 2 days. Not talking, just moving. Just the physical problem of getting 2 people and 3 animals up into country that required more of all of them than the country below had. They made camp on the second evening in a hollow between ridges where a stand of dense spruce blocked the worst of the wind. Rourke built a fire in the time it took her to unsaddle the horses. No wasted motion. No second attempts at anything. Just the right action in the right sequence, like a man whose body knew the steps without being told. She watched him and memorized what she saw, because she understood already that everything she watched him do was something she was going to need to know how to do herself. She helped with the food without being asked. He made room without comment. When she reached for the salt before he'd mentioned it, he noticed. She could tell by the slight pause before he handed it to her. They ate without much talking. The fire popped. One of the horses shifted weight in the dark behind them. Overhead, the wind moved through the tops of the spruce with a sound like water running over stones. "There are rules," Rourke said, looking at the fire, not at her. "Tell me." "Never go past the East Ridge alone, not until you know the land. The drop is hidden under snow. Looks like flat ground until it isn't." She absorbed it. "What else?" "Never open the cabin door during a whiteout without tying off first." He paused. "If you lose sight of the cabin in a whiteout, you stay where you are. Don't walk blind." The horses. He glanced at her. You were going to say the horses know the weather, she said. A pause that was almost something. Watch them, he said. If they both stop eating, something's coming. She nodded. What else? Don't try to manage the mountain. He looked back at the fire. People die up there trying to beat it. You work with it. Even when it costs you time. Even when it feels wrong. He paused. Especially when it feels wrong. And rules about you, she said. He looked at her then. Things I should know, she said. Working with you. Living in the same space. Something in his face shifted. Not discomfort. More like the expression of a man trying to describe terrain in a country he hasn't spoken about for a long time. I don't make small talk, he said. I noticed. I'll tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. If I think you're doing something wrong, I'll say so. Same, she said. He looked at her. Same, she said again. I'll say so too. A long pause. I've been alone up there for 5 years, he said. I may not, he stopped, started differently. I'm not easy to be around. Marin looked at the fire. Neither am I, she said. I've been told I'm severe. That corner of his mouth moved, just barely. Severe, he said. Tonight, 2 women at the gathering. They thought they were whispering. What did they say? That I stare at things like I'm annoyed at them. He was quiet for a moment. Are you, he said. She thought about it honestly. Sometimes, she said, when things aren't working right and nobody's fixing them. He said, that's useful up there. She looked at him. Severe means you don't pretend, he said. That's useful. Marin considered this. Good night, Rourke, she said. Rourke, he said. What? Just Rourke. Nobody calls me anything else. She lay down facing the fire and pulled her blanket around her. Good night, she said. A pause. Good night, he said. She lay in the dark and listened to the fire and the wind and the horses and the distant sound the mountains made at night, which was nothing like any sound she'd heard before. A deep, slow presence. Something very old and very large that had no opinion about her whatsoever. She was afraid, and she was more awake than she'd been in years, and she wasn't sure those were different things. The cabin appeared on the afternoon of the 3rd day. She'd thought coming over the last ridge that there was still another ridge behind it. There was always another ridge. That was one of the things the mountain had established clearly over 3 days. It was larger than you thought. It was always larger than you thought. But Rourke said there, and she looked up. It sat in a natural hollow halfway up a north-facing slope, tucked against a rock face that cut the worst of the west wind. Larger than she'd expected. The logs were heavy and dark with age and weatherproofing, and the roof sat under a layer of snow that was clearly solid beneath it. A woodshed ran along the eastern wall. Full, she registered. Full to the ceiling with split logs. A rope line ran between the main cabin and a small outbuilding 20 feet away. She knew what that was before he explained it. For whiteouts, she said. Yes. She looked at the cabin for a moment. Really looked. Not at what it wasn't, at what it was. It's good, she said. He glanced at her sideways. Most people say it looks like a prison, he said. Most people don't know what they're looking at. He turned back to the cabin and she thought, but wasn't certain that something shifted in his shoulders. Something that had been held slightly too tight briefly letting go. Inside smelled like cold wood and pine resin and smoke and leather. Not unpleasant, just specific. Like a library where only one person had ever chosen the books. A cook stove, a table and 2 chairs, shelving along every wall loaded with supplies organized in a system she couldn't decode yet, but would. A narrow bed against the north wall. Skins on the floor. A lamp that Rourke lit immediately, and the yellow light spread through the space and showed her everything at once. 2 nails on one wall set differently from all the others. She saw them because she was looking for them. The way you look for things you've been told to look for without being told directly. One nail was set rough, driven in at a slight angle, the head a little uneven. The other was set clean and true head flush, the kind of nail that goes in right the first time by someone who knows how. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at the shelf nearest to her, loaded with supplies all organized with precise care. But the back edge of the shelf where the wood met the wall had a thin line of a different wood, slightly newer, slightly cleaner. Repaired, she realized. Broken at some point and repaired. By different hands. Two people had built this place. Two people had maintained it. Two people had driven nails and repaired shelves and made it what it was. And now there was only one. She didn't say anything. Rourke showed her the second room, a small space with a bunk he'd built recently enough that the wood still smelled of fresh cutting. He said he'd sleep in the main room, that this was hers. He said it gruffly in the manner of someone who has made a decision and is now on the other side of it and not looking back. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, came inside, closed the door. The wind pressed against the walls with the full weight of its attention, and the logs held and the lamp burned, and Maren Voss stood in the middle of her new life for a moment and felt the full weight of everything she'd left behind. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the peg by the door, and turned to Rourke. "Show me how the cook stove works," she said, "and where you keep the wood for it, and which side of the flue sticks in cold weather." He looked at her. "All of it," she said. "Tonight. Start now." The corner of his mouth moved again. "The flue," he said. "It sticks on the left. You have to use the poker at an angle, not straight up. There's a lip on the damper that's warped from the freezes." "Show me." He showed her, and that was how it started. The days settled into a rhythm that wasn't comfortable exactly, but was functional. And functional on a mountain in winter was better than comfortable in a leaking cabin in a town where you owed money to half the county. Rourke was gone before she woke most mornings. She'd hear him sometimes in the space between sleep and full waking, the sound of his boots on the cabin floor, the scrape of the door bar lifting the brief invasion of cold, and then the door closing against it. By the time she was dressed and had the fire going, he'd been out on the near trap lines for 2 hours. He came back mid-morning, usually with something, sometimes without. He'd drop whatever he'd taken from the traps on the table outside, come and pour coffee. Stand at the window for a few minutes looking north at the ridgeline, not speaking. She learned not to speak at him during those minutes. Not because he asked her not to, because she watched him and understood what those minutes were. He'd been alone for 5 years. The re-entry into a space that contained another person took a few minutes to manage. She gave him the minutes, and he used them, and then he'd turn around and be present again. She did the same thing, actually. When she came back from checking the near snares alone in the early mornings, there were a few minutes where she just needed to stand somewhere and let the space between outside and inside settle. She didn't mention it. He didn't mention it. Neither of them mentioned anything that didn't need mentioning, which turned out to be its own kind of company. He taught her to skin a rabbit in 15 minutes. She took 40 the first time, and he said nothing, and she did it again the next day in 30, and he said nothing, and the day after that she did it in 20. And he handed her the coffee without being asked. He showed her tracks, crouching in the snow and pointing at compression at crystal formation at the edge of a print at the way when had or hadn't yet touched the inside of it. How old? Which direction? What kind? She had spent 25 years paying attention to things that other people didn't look at because her survival in that cabin with her father had depended on reading situations correctly and early, and she found that this reading the land, the signs it left, was not entirely unlike what she already knew how to do. "You're not bad at writing sign," he said one morning. She'd identified a fox track crossing a deer trail and estimated it was from the previous evening. "You say that like you expected me to be worse." "I expected it to take longer." She absorbed this. "How much longer?" He stood, brushed snow from his knee. 3 weeks, maybe 4. It had been 9 days. She didn't let herself feel anything about that in front of him, but she held it carefully in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. The rifle was harder. Her instinct was wrong. She kept anticipating the shot, flinching before the trigger broke, pulling the barrel at the last second. Rourke watched her miss 5 times in a row without comment. Then he said, "Stop trying to make it happen." She lowered the rifle. "What does that mean?" "You're pushing at the moment." He moved to stand beside her, not touching, close enough to speak without raising his voice. "The shot has to surprise you, even when you know it's coming. You set everything right position, breath, sight line, and then you let it go." She raised the rifle. "Let it go." The rifle went off and the plank she'd been aiming at jumped. She'd clipped the edge, not center, but contact. Better, he said. She shot it again the next day and hit center. He turned and walked back toward the cabin without ceremony, and she stood in the snow with the rifle and felt something that was too complicated and too tired to be called pride, but lived in the same neighborhood. On the night of the first hard storm, she found the letter. Not on purpose. She'd been looking for the land deed. She'd started going through the cabin's paperwork in the evenings when Rourke was working on equipment repair because she was a partner and partners understood what they held. The deed, the survey records, the claim documentation. She found them in the second drawer, and underneath them, in the back corner of the drawer, was an envelope. Old. The paper slightly yellowed. The handwriting on the front was not Cale Rourke's. It was someone else's, a lighter, more practiced hand. More social. The return address was a valley town she didn't recognize. The name on the envelope, Declan Rourke. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned it over. The back had already been opened. Opened, and she could see, refolded carefully. Someone had read it. Someone had kept it. She should have put it back. She should have. She unfolded the letter. It was addressed to Declan Rourke, but at the top of the page in a different ink someone had written for Cale, when the time comes. Below that, the letter began. It was from a man named Aldous Crane. Brief, businesslike, almost polite the way certain kinds of threat can be polite when they've been dressed carefully. It said that Mr. Crane remained interested in the purchase of the North Ridge properties, that the Territory Development Office had begun its review of all outstanding mineral claims in advance of the spring railroad survey, and that claims which could not demonstrate continuous active use by their registered holders by the opening of that survey season would be subject to administrative review. It said that Mr. Crane would be happy to discuss purchase terms at any time before that date. It said the terms would be considerably less favorable after that date than before it. It said, without saying it, the clock is running. The letter was dated 1876. At the bottom, in different ink, in a different handwriter, more social, were 6 words. Tell him no. We're not selling. And underneath, D. Marin read it twice. Then a third time. Then she sat back and looked at the cook stove and thought about what she was holding. Crane had sent this letter in 1876. Declan had written a response in the margin. And then the following year, 1877, Declan had died on the road from town, which everyone had called an accident, which Cale had never believed was an accident. And now Crane was moving again. Not because he'd decided to start, because he'd run out of time to wait. The railroad survey started in the spring. Not when the railroad arrived, but when the official survey team came through and locked in which land claims would sit on the corridor and which wouldn't. If Crane could get the Northridge claim invalidated or acquired before that survey team arrived, the silver underneath it became his. He'd been waiting 5 years for Cale to fail or leave or give up, and Cale hadn't. And now Crane was out of patience. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope. Put the envelope back in the corner of the drawer where she'd found it, but did not put the land deed on top of it this time. She left it accessible. She didn't tell Rourke, not yet, because she didn't have enough yet. She had a piece of a picture, and you didn't make decisions about incomplete pictures. You gathered more until the picture was clear. She was still turning it over when she went out the next morning to check the snare she'd set in the drawer behind the woodshed. That was when she found the tracks. 3 sets of horse prints, running along the eastern boundary of the property, not across it, following the line of the ridge rather than crossing it. Recent enough that the edges were still clean, the wind hadn't had time to round them off. These were not hunting tracks, not a trapper's tracks. They ran too deliberately, followed too consistent a line. Someone mapping the perimeter, someone learning the shape of the property from the outside. She crouched beside the prints and looked at them for a long time. Then she stood up and went back to the cabin. Rourke was at the table with his coffee when she came in. She told him exactly what she'd found: the number of horses, the line they'd taken, the age of the prints. He went still in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the stillness of listening, something older than that, something that lived below decision-making in the part of a person that responds before the thinking starts. How many sets, he said. 3. A pause. And they ran east to west along the boundary, following the ridgeline, not crossing it, He was quiet. Crane, he said. He's not coming because he thinks you're weak, she said. She kept her voice level, factual. He's coming because he's out of time. The railroad survey starts in the spring. After that date, any administrative claim review gets complicated. He needs to move before spring. Rourke looked at her. How do you know that? He said. She held his gaze. Because I read, she said. He let that sit for a moment. Then what did you find? She told him about the letter in the drawer. All of it. The date 1876, the language, the tone. Declan's response in the margin. The deadline Crane had been operating against all along. She watched Rourke's face while she told him. It didn't break. It wasn't the kind of face that broke. But it changed in the way that faces change when the name of a dead person gets said out loud. Like a door opening briefly into a room where something is stored that you don't go into except when you have to. I should have told you about it sooner, he said, after a while. Which part? All of it. He looked at his hands. Crane, what he's after, what he'll do to get it. A pause. What he did. Your brother, she said. He was quiet for a moment. They said it was the ice. Road conditions. Horse went down. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He'd made that road in worse conditions than that. 30 times. Maybe more. You couldn't prove it. No. And going down there with a rifle instead of evidence would have gotten me hanged and given him the ridge, he said. Yes. Flat, clean. The sound of a man who has been over this road so many times it's worn smooth. So I stayed up here, held the ground, waited for something I could use. Marin looked at the window, at the gray winter sky beyond it. Declan wrote, "Tell him no," in the margin of that letter, she said. Yes, that means Declan knew Crane was dangerous before he went down to the valley. He knew, and he went anyway. He thought the legal path was still open. Rourke looked at the stove. He believed the territory office was still operating as it was supposed to. Was it? A long pause. One of the registrars took money, he said. We found out later, Aldrich, deputy registrar. He had debts of his own and Crane offered to clear them. His voice was very flat, very controlled. Declan's surveys were on file. The claim was legitimate, but Aldrich found ways to raise questions, create delays. Enough delays that Declan kept having to come back down to address them. Marin was very still. Enough delays, she said slowly, that Crane knew when Declan would be on the road, on a specific night, in specific conditions. Rourke said nothing. She let that sit in the space between them. Then she stood up and got the papers from the drawer. All of them. The deed, the survey records, the claim documentation. And Crane's letter. She spread them on the table. Sit down, she said. He looked at the papers, then at her. Sit down, she said again. We need to know exactly what we're holding and exactly what's coming. And we need to know it before he decides to stop sending scouts. A pause, then Rourke sat. She was gathering her coat to go check the far snares 10 days later when she stopped. Something was wrong. Not a sound, not a visible thing. Just a shift in the quality of the cabin's silence. The horses had gone quiet in the outbuilding. Both of them. Not the quiet of sleep. A listening quiet. She waited. The horses stayed quiet. She put on her coat, checked the rifle, which she now checked every time she went outside as a matter of habit, and went out. The snow was bright and the air was sharp and nothing moved. But when she went to the edge of the clearing and looked south, she saw the wolf tracks. Large. Fresh. 2 sets moving along the south side of the timberline parallel to the cabin heading east. Heading toward where Cale was working. She told herself he's handled wolves before. 5 years alone up here. He knows the signs. She got halfway to the woodshed and stopped. She told herself he'll be fine. He's experienced. She stood in the clearing for 2 full minutes doing this, arguing herself into staying where she was, because it was logical, because she didn't know the East Line well enough yet, because he was experienced and she wasn't, and the most useful thing she could do was stay at the cabin, and she picked up the rifle and went. She found him in the hammered draw 40 minutes out on the East Line. He was on his side in the snow, partially under the overhang of a rock shelf. Not buried, he'd gotten himself there, some part of him still working, still making decisions, even while the rest of him was deciding whether to stop. The wolf prints around him told the story. 2. No, she looked more carefully. 3. The third had run. The first one lay 12 feet away. The second had taken a wound and left a blood trail heading northeast. Rourke! She was on her knees beside him before she'd finished saying his name. She put her hand on his face. Cold. Deep cold. But not the cold of he was still breathing. She put her face close to his, and she could feel it. The slow, careful movement of someone who has put everything into staying alive and has very little left over for anything else. Rourke! Louder, his eyes opened, partially, not tracking yet. I'm here, she said. Stay with me. His coat was torn across the left shoulder and upper arm. Torn the way teeth tear not a cut, not a blade, but the jagged, uneven work of something that had been meaning to take him down. Dark stains in the snow around him, some of it old, some of it not. Can you hear me? Yes, rough, wrong, the voice of a man using the last of something to produce words. I need you to help me get you on the sled. Go back. I'm not going back. Marin, trying to make it in order. Not enough left in him to make it in order. I hear you, she said. I'm still not going back. The sled was 15 feet away. She'd seen it when she came into the draw. One of the small freight sleds he used to haul heavy loads from the far lines. One runner was cracked, but the platform was solid. She dragged it to him. Getting him onto it took everything she had. He tried to help, and his attempts to help made it harder, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Twice she had to stop and breathe and reset before trying again. But she got him on it on his back, and she looped the rope across his chest and under his arm so he wouldn't slide off when the terrain changed. She took the rope and pulled. The sled didn't want to move. The broken runner caught and skipped on the uneven snow. His weight was significant, and the draw ran slightly uphill in the direction she needed to go. She put the rope over her shoulder and leaned into it, not lifting, not muscling it, putting her whole body weight against the resistance, finding the angle, the way you learn to do with a stuck door or a heavy load or any other thing that required you to work with physics instead of against it. The sled moved, 6 inches, then a foot. Then it found a groove where previous passage had compressed the snow, and it moved more easily, and she walked 1 foot in front of the other, the rope over her shoulder, the rifle in her other hand. She didn't think about the distance. One of the things the mountain had taught her in 3 weeks was this: you don't think about how far the end is. You think about the next step, and then the one after that. You take the impossible thing and break it into the smallest possible unit, and you do that unit, and then you do the next one. He said her name once about 20 minutes in. Low, almost not there. I'm here, she said, without stopping. The shoulder, he said. I know. It needs... I know, she said. I know what it needs when we get back. He was quiet after that. She was grateful for that because she needed everything she had for the ground under her feet and the rope over her shoulder. The wolves came back on the upper slope. She heard them before she saw them. The soft, purposeful sound of animals moving through snow towards something specific. Not howling. That was the dramatic version. The real version was quieter and worse. She stopped, turned. 2 of them, at the edge of her vision, standing still the way wolves stand when they're deciding. Not threatening yet, calculating. She had 1 hand on the rope and 1 hand on the rifle, and the rope was over her shoulder, and she couldn't use both at once. She set the rope down. She brought the rifle up. And then she did not try to make it happen. She positioned, she breathed, let half out, held, and she did not try to make it happen. The rifle went off and the snow between her and the wolves erupted, and both of them bolted, clearing the space between them and the tree line in seconds gone before the echo finished. She stood in the dark for a long moment with the rifle in both hands and the echo fading off the ridge walls. Then she put the rope back over her shoulder and started walking. She found the rope line in the dark by the faint ridge of snow collected along the top of it. She grabbed it with both hands and followed it to the outbuilding, then to the cabin door, and she got the bar up and got the door open. She couldn't lift him off the sled. She got blankets from the bunk and spread them on the floor. She cut the rope she'd tied across his chest because her fingers couldn't untie it. She rolled him off the sled onto the blankets, which was not gentle, and she couldn't help that. She got the fire going. The cold coming back into her hands was one of the worst things she had felt in 25 years. The returning circulation felt like being taken apart and reassembled wrong. She opened and closed her fists and breathed through her nose and kept moving. She got his coat off. The wound was worse than the dark had let her assess. She went to the shelf where the medical supplies were. Because she had found them in the second week the way she had found everything in this cabin in the first 2 weeks by going through it and learning where things were and what they were for. Carbolic, needle and thread, clean cloth. She brought them to where he lay on the floor. "This is going to be worse than the sled," she said. "I know." More present now. The warmth of the cabin working on him. "You can tell me if I'm doing something wrong." "I will." A pause. "You need to pull the edges together before you stitch. It'll bleed more for a moment." "I know." She poured the carbolic and he made a sound he immediately contained. She worked fast, but not careless. The stitching was not elegant. She didn't have the angle or the training for elegant, but it was tight and even, and when she tied it off, she knew it would hold. She worked for over an hour. When she finished, her back ached and her hands were shaking not from cold this time, but from the sustained concentration of doing something that mattered very much for a very long time without being allowed to stop. She sat back on the floor and looked at what she'd done. Closed. Held. The bleeding stopped. Rourke turned his head and looked at her. His face had the gray quality of blood loss, but his eyes were clear and tracking. "You came out in that," he said. "You didn't come back. I told you to leave me." "I know." "Marin, I know what you said." She met his eyes. "I heard you." He was quiet for a long time. "Declan," he said. She stilled. "He used to say when something needed doing, he'd say someone's got to be the one to do it. Like it was obvious. Like it was just the next thing." He looked at the ceiling. "I always thought that was him." Just him. Marin looked at her hands in her lap, the rope marks across both palms already darkening toward what they'd be by morning. "Get some sleep," she said. He closed his eyes. She stayed on the floor beside him until she was certain his breathing had settled into something steady and deep. Then she pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and sat in the warm cabin while the fire burned down and the wind outside did what wind did. She thought, "I came up here to survive." She thought, "I don't know when that changed." She thought when he said Declan's name in his sleep on the sled when I heard it come out of him, like something that lived in a place below decision, that was when I understood that this man is carrying something I can't see the edges of. And for some reason I cannot explain, and I'm not going to try to explain tonight, I don't want him to carry it alone. She looked at the letter from Crane that was still on the table where they'd left the papers. The terms would be considerably less favorable after that date than before it. Deadline, spring, before the railroad survey team arrived. She thought about Declan's handwriting in the margin. Light and social and completely unafraid. Tell him no. We're not selling. She looked at her hands. Then she stood up, got the paper and the pen from the shelf, and sat at the table and began to write. Not a battle plan. A list of what they had, what they could prove, what they needed to gather before spring. The fire burned low. The wind worked at the walls. Marin Voss sat at the table in a cabin on a mountain in Wyoming in the winter of 1882 and made the first draft of something that would matter. Outside the mountain held its cold and patient silence and waited to see what she would do next. Rourke healed slowly, which frustrated him in a way he couldn't quite conceal and which Marin had decided not to mention because she understood it. The frustration wasn't weakness. It was a man who had been sole caretaker of something important for 5 years, watching the days pass from a bunk while the world outside the cabin required doing. She did the doing. She checked the near trap lines every morning before he was fully awake. She brought in wood, managed the horses, tracked the weather by the instruments he'd shown her, and by the horses themselves, and by the quality of light on the North Ridge, which changed in ways she was still learning to read, but was learning. She kept the list on the table. Every evening she added to it. What they had, what they could prove, what they needed before spring, the claim documentation, the original survey records, Crane's letter with the 1876 date on it and Declan's handwriting in the margin. Notes on the scout tracks she'd found with dates and locations marked on the rough map she'd copied from the cabin's original. Rourke watched her do this from the bunk. He didn't say that won't work. He didn't say let me do it. He said on the fourth night, the survey records from '69. They're in the second drawer underneath the land deed. There's also a letter from the territory office confirming the original claim registration. You'll want that. She got up and found it. This one. She held it up. He looked. That's it. She added it to the stack. The date on Crane's letter, he said. It matters that it predates. I know, she said. It establishes a pattern going back 6 years, prior to your brother's death. I'm going to argue that the pattern itself is the evidence, even if we can't prove the specific act. He was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn that? He said. I haven't learned it. I'm reasoning it out. She sat back down. Is there a reason it wouldn't work? He thought about it. Honestly. No, he said. It should work. Good. She kept writing. On the 7th day he was sitting up. On the 9th he was at the table. On the 10th he went outside, walked to the woodshed and back, and came in and didn't say anything about how much it had cost him, but she could tell by the way he sat down afterward. The west snare line, he said once he caught his breath. I moved the third snare. He looked up. There was fresh sign near the deadfall. The old location wasn't reading it. I put it where the compressed run goes under the east side. She poured him coffee without being asked. Both snares were full this morning. He looked at the coffee, then at her. That's where I almost put it last season, he said. I know, I found the disturbed snow from where you'd been considering the placement. A pause. You read the snow where I'd been thinking, he said. You stood there for a while, turned around twice. She sat down across from him. Why didn't you move it? He wrapped both hands around the cup. Habit, he said. I'd set it in the old location for 2 seasons. It felt wrong to change it. He paused. Declan used to tell me I was too loyal to my own decisions. She said nothing to that. Sometimes the right response to a thing was to let it occupy the space it needed. He drank his coffee and looked at the window, and she looked at the list, and the wind outside moved through the high country in the way it moved in late February, which was not quite winter and not quite anything else. The days were getting longer, not warm, not easy, but longer. Crane came on a gray morning in early March. She knew he was coming before she saw him. The horses went quiet first. Then the ravens at the east tree line lifted and didn't come back. Then there was a quality of stillness on the south slope that was different from ordinary stillness, the way a room feels different when someone has just left it. She went to the window. Rourke. He was already coming out of the second room, moving carefully on the leg, which wasn't fully right yet, but functional. He'd been insisting on functional for 2 weeks. He came to the window and stood beside her. They looked south, 4 riders, coming up the main trail from the timberline. Count, he said. 4 horses, 4 men. One of the horses is carrying extra. She studied it. Supplies, not equipment. They plan to stay. Rourke said nothing. He thinks it's already done, she said. Rourke's jaw moved. The man at the front was not any of the 3 she'd identified from the scout tracks. He rode with the posture of a man accustomed to being the most significant person in any given situation. Not arrogant exactly, something more settled than arrogance. The confidence of a man who has been right about outcomes for long enough that being right has stopped feeling like an accomplishment and started feeling like the natural order of things. Medium height, good coat, hat that hadn't earned its wear yet, administrative. That was the word that came to her. He looked like a man reviewing a property he'd already decided to acquire. That's Crane, Rourke said. Very quiet, she'd known it. The south deadfall, she said. Yes. First switchback. They won't see the cabin until they've cleared it. Yes. She had built the deadfall 12 days ago. 280 pounds of log rigged to a pressure plate set at the weight of a loaded horse's footfall positioned at the first switchback on the south trail, where the ridge walls came close on both sides and there was nowhere to go sideways. She had tested the trigger mechanism twice. She had gone back a 3rd time after the second test and adjusted the angle of the support by 2 inches to account for the specific compression of the snow at that location. She was not uncertain about the trigger mechanism. They watched Crane's party come up the trail, 4 horses in single file moving at the pace of men who didn't expect obstacles. The first man reached the switchback. The crack was audible from the cabin. Then the heavier sound of the released 300 pounds of log dropping from the prepared overhang onto the trail directly in front of the lead horse landing, with a concussive impact that sent snow exploding sideways off both ridge walls. The lead horse screamed and went sideways. The rider went over. The second horse bolted back down the trail, tangling with the third. Men shouted. The pack horse lurched sideways and the supplies it carried shifted and it staggered. Crane's horse held. She'd expected that. A man like Crane would have a horse with good nerves and better training. But even a good horse had limits, and this one was dancing sideways on a trail 2 feet wide, with its ears pinned and its eyes showing white. Crane had both hands occupied, for the moment. "Window," Marin said. "Yes." She went to the door. They'd discussed this, who covered what angle, why, from where. They'd had 12 days to discuss it, and they'd been thorough, and she had a specific position and a specific role, and she went to it. She positioned herself behind the door, which she'd left open 3 inches on the latch. Enough to see through, more than enough to shoot through. The man who'd gone over the lead horse was on his feet. He was looking up the trail toward the cabin clearing. Crane had gotten his horse still. He was looking up too. His face was not the face of a man who had decided the situation was over. It was the face of a man recalculating. From the window, Rourke's voice, flat and caring in the cold air. "Crane." The clearing went still. "Rourke." Crane's voice had the forced evenness of a man who had planned a different kind of conversation than the one he was now in. "I heard you'd had some trouble. Came to discuss the property matter." "The property matter is settled, has been for 15 years. The Territory Development Office has some questions about the documentation. The documentation is in order. There are concerns about continuous active use. The property is actively used." A pause. "I came to discuss purchase terms," Crane said. "Reasonable terms. I think if you looked at the numbers—" Crane. The word landed like a period. "You waited 5 years for me to give up or die. I didn't. You sent scouts to assess my position while I was recovering from an injury. I noted that. And now you've come up here on a March morning with 4 men and a pack horse, loaded for an extended stay." Rourke's voice was very even, very controlled. The voice of a man who has been on this road a long time and knows every stone of it. "I know what kind of visit this is." Silence. The man on Crane's left started moving sideways, toward the east, toward the draw. Marin opened the door 6 more inches. "The east draw is not a better option," she said. Her voice carried clearly in the cold air. Clear and level, not raised. The man stopped. He looked toward the cabin, then toward the draw, then at her or at the door, trying to locate the angle. Crane said, "Who is that?" Not quite a question. The flatness of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit his prepared version of events. "That's my partner," Rourke said. The word landed in the clearing and sat there. Crane looked at the door. Then something happened that Marin hadn't planned for and didn't expect. One of the men, not the one moving toward the draw, a different one, the one who'd been hanging back on the trail since the deadfall, said something quietly to Crane. She couldn't hear it. But she saw Crane's expression change. Not dramatically, just around the edges. The adjustment of a man who has just been given information that doesn't fit the model he arrived with. "Mrs. Rourke," Crane said. "Yes," she said. Through the door, she watched him process this, watched him recalculate whatever picture he'd arrived with the injured trapper, the isolated cabin, the straightforward absorption of a position he'd been patient about for years, and find that the new information didn't produce the outcome he'd planned. "I'd like to speak with you," Crane said, reasonably, "about what we can offer." "There's nothing to discuss," she said. Not aggressive, just clear. "Mrs. Rourke, the claim is valid, current, and actively held. The documentation supports it. We have the original survey records, the registration confirmation, and a letter from you dated 1876 that establishes your interest in acquiring this property 6 years before you had any legal standing to contest our claim." She paused. "And we have notes on the scout activity along our eastern boundary that we can date and position." She let that sit. Crane was very still. "You have a clean trail south," she said. "It goes all the way back to the timberline. I left it clear on purpose." She opened the door 1 more inch. "4 men came up that trail this morning. 4 men can go back down it." The clearing was quiet. Very quiet. The kind of quiet that has making up its mind in it. She watched Crane look at the window where Rourke was, then at the door where she was, then at the south trail, then at the east draw where his man had stopped moving. She watched him do the arithmetic, what he'd sent up the trail against what the trail had given back, what he'd expected to find at the top of it against what he'd found. A woman who knew about the scouts, who had the date on his letter, who had said the east draw was not a better option, with the calm of someone who had made the east draw not a better option before she'd said so. He looked at the man on his left. The man gave a small, barely perceptible shake of his head. Crane looked at the cabin for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. He went back down the south trail without another word, without looking back, and his men followed, and the sound of the horses diminished through the trees, and the morning went quiet again. Really quiet. She stood at the door and counted to 60 before she moved. Then she opened the door fully and stepped outside and looked at the south trail and saw nothing. Just snow and the marks where the horses had been. She walked to the deadfall, looked at it. The trigger had done exactly what it was supposed to do. She'd need to reset it. She noted that in the immediate list. She came back inside. Rourke was at the table. He'd sat down, which told her something about what the morning had cost him. His face had the gray quality of a man who has spent physical resources he was still building back. "He'll reconsider," he said. "Yes. More men. Different approach." "Yes." She took off her coat, hung it on the peg. "But not today." He was looking at her. Not the way he'd looked at her at Ferris Belford's barn. Not reading her. Already knew what he'd find. Looking the way you look at something when you've decided something about it, and you're working out how to say the decision. "You told him about the scouts," he said. "Yes." "He didn't know I knew." "He didn't know either of us knew. That's different. He came up here thinking the cabin held an injured man who was running out of time to hold his position." She sat down across from him. "He's leaving knowing the cabin holds 2 people who have been preparing for him." Rourke was quiet for a long moment. "Where'd you find the East Draw reference?" he said. "I walked it," she said. 2 weeks ago." His expression changed. "That section is 5 hours out in bad conditions. I know. I left at 4 in the morning and was back by midday." She held his gaze. "I'm not reckless." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "You're not." The following week they went down the mountain. Not because the snow had fully cleared, not because the timing was comfortable, but because the Territory Circuit Court was sitting in the valley for its March session, and Wren Aldrich would be in attendance, and they had a document window of 11 days before the railroad survey team's advance party arrived in the territory. 11 days. She had the papers in an oilskin packet inside her coat. Everything. The claim records, the survey documentation, the registration confirmation, Crane's letter from 1876, her notes on the scout activity, organized in the order a legal argument required. Rourke rode in front. The silence between them on the way down was different from the silence on the way up. On the way up, the silence had been the silence of 2 people who didn't know each other. Now it was the silence of people who knew each other well enough that the silence didn't need filling. Crow Hollow received them the way small communities receive things that have become larger than expected. Word had traveled over the winter. It always traveled. Crow Hollow had its own telegraph made of visitors and traders, and the human need to report interesting developments to the next person encountered. People had heard fragments. The trapper was hurt. Someone was up there with him. Crane's men had been seen heading north and coming back down without the purposeful look they'd gone up with. The pieces existed. What they found when they arrived was a town that had assembled the fragments into various shapes, none of them complete. Marin saw her father from the end of the main street. He was standing in front of the dry goods store with the slightly unfocused look of a man who'd had a difficult winter and was processing something he'd been told to expect and still didn't know how to receive. She rode to him, dismounted. He looked at her hands, at her face, at the coat that had been mended in 2 additional places since November, at the way she stood, which was different from how she'd stood in November, in ways she probably couldn't have articulated, but that she could feel in her own bones. "Marin," he said. "Papa." He looked past her at Rourke, who had dismounted and was holding both horses, and looking at the middle distance with the tact of a large man giving 2 people the space to have a conversation. "I heard some things," her father said, "about the winter." "I imagine you did." "I thought—" He stopped. His hands were steadier than they'd been in November, she noticed. Not steady, steadier. "I thought several times that someone was going to come down from that mountain with bad news." "I know." "Are you—" "I'm here, Papa." She met his eyes. "That's the news." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did what faces do when they've been carrying something at cost for a long time and have finally found somewhere to set it down. He put his arms around her. Awkward, uncertain. The embrace of a man who had not been a father in any real sense for years and was attempting to remember the shape of it. She stood in it for a moment and let him. Because he was her father and because some things were true about people, even when other things about those people were also true at the same time, and that was just how people were. Then she stepped back. "I have things to do today," she said. "I'll come by tonight." He nodded. She went. The territory office was a single-story building on the east side of the main street with a counter and 2 clerks and a back room where the registrar kept his records. The man at the counter looked up when she came in and looked at her with the expression of someone processing the distance between what he'd expected to see come through the door and what had. "I need to speak with Ren Aldrich," she said. "He's in the back with a—" "Tell him it's about the Rourke claim on the North Ridge." She set the oilskin packet on the counter. "And tell him it's time-sensitive." The clerk disappeared into the back. She waited. Rourke came in 2 minutes later and stood beside her without speaking. They waited together the same way they'd done most things over the winter. Side by side, not performing anything. Just present. The back door opened. Ren Aldrich was 30 years old with his father's careful eyes and something else in his face that his father evidently hadn't had the expression of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and was working out whether this was it. He looked at Rourke, then at Marin, then at the oilskin packet. "I heard you were coming," he said. "Then you know why," Rourke said. "I know some of it." He came fully through the door, stood across the counter. "My father told me about the Rourke claim before he died. Told me about Crane." He paused. "He told me he'd made an error." Those were his words. An error. Something moved in his face. He wasn't a bad man. He had debts of his own, and Crane offered to clear them, and he told himself it wouldn't matter. Nobody said anything. "It mattered," Aldrich said. "Yes," Rourke said. Aldrich looked at the oilskin packet. He kept records. Everything he did regarding the Rourke claim, every delay he manufactured, every question he raised that he knew was unfounded. He kept it all in a locked box in his desk at home. He said it carefully, steadily, the way you say something that has cost you something to carry and is costing you something to put down. He told me to keep it, said someday someone would come to this office with a real claim, in Crane's letter and enough documentation to make the whole picture legible. He looked at Rourke. He said when that happened, I should use his records to fill in the parts they couldn't prove themselves. Rourke said nothing. His face had done the thing it did when the name of his brother occupied the room. That brief opening, that glimpse of the room behind the door. "He's dead," Rourke said. Finally. "Yes. The records he kept. They're in the box, at my house." Aldrich met his eyes. "I've had them for 3 years. I was waiting for you to come down." Marin heard this, absorbed it. A man had done wrong and known it, and kept the evidence of his own wrongdoing, so that someday when the time came, someone could use it to correct what he'd broken. It wasn't enough. She knew that. It was nowhere near enough for what had been lost. It didn't give Declan back. It didn't give Rourke back the 5 years on the mountain. It didn't change what Crane had done or absolve what Aldrich's father had permitted. But it was something. It was the difference between a closed door and an open one. "Get the box," she said. Aldrich looked at her. "We have 11 days before the survey team arrives," she said. "Get the box, bring it here, and we're going to build the clearest record the territory has seen of what Aldous Crane has been doing in this valley for the last 6 years." She held his gaze. "Your father made an error. You get to decide what you do with what he left you." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he went to get his coat. The circuit court hearing took 2 days. Crane arrived on the second morning with his own lawyer, a smooth man from the territorial capital, who had the practiced air of someone paid to make complex situations seem simple. He arrived with counter-documentation and a prepared argument about the inadequacy of the Rourke claim's continuous active use. He had not expected Aldrich's father's records. Marin watched Crane's lawyer read through them at the plaintiff's table, and she watched the lawyer's face do something subtle and important. The face of a man discovering that the model he'd been given of the opposition's position was significantly incomplete. Crane himself looked at the records with the expression of a man calculating the cost of what he was reading. He looked up once. He looked at Marin. Not at Rourke. At her. She looked back. Not aggressive, not triumphant, just present. The same way she'd been present in Ferris Belford's barn in November, except that everything was different now, and she was different now, and the difference was in her face, and she didn't try to cover it. She took the stand. She described what she'd found in the cabin, what she'd found in the drawer, the scout tracks, the dates, the locations. She described the morning of Crane's arrival, the deadfall, the exchange at the clearing. She described Crane's reference to the East Draw and her response. She spoke without embellishment and without performance. She said what had happened in the order it had happened with the specific details she had noted at the time. The judge, a circuit judge named Pemberton, who had the expression of a man who had heard most of what people could do to each other and had developed the corresponding patience, listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he read Aldrich Sr.'s records. For a long time. He set them down. "Mr. Crane," he said. Crane's lawyer was already on his feet. Judge Pemberton looked at him. The lawyer sat back down. "Mr. Crane," the judge said again, looking directly at the man at the other table. "The original Rourke claim on the Northridge properties is valid, properly registered, and has been continuously and actively held by the registered parties." He paused. "Your company's documentation suggesting otherwise has been produced in a context that, given the records now before this court, suggests a pattern of administrative interference going back 6 years. I intend to refer that pattern to the Territorial Governor's Office for separate review." Crane said nothing. "The claim stands," Judge Pemberton said, "as registered, as filed, as held." He looked at Rourke, then at Marin. "Is there anything else?" Marin looked at Rourke. He looked at her. "No," she said. "That's everything." They walked out of the courthouse into the March afternoon. The air was cold, but different from mountain cold, valley cold, which meant it had a ceiling, which meant in a few months it would be warm down here, warm enough for the cottonwood along the creek to start thinking about leaves. She stood on the step for a moment and breathed. Rourke stood beside her. "He won't come back," she said. "Probably not. The referral to the governor's office makes the risk too high for what the ridge is worth to him now that it's been properly documented." She looked at the street, at the ordinary business of an ordinary afternoon in a small valley town. "He'll find somewhere else, some other piece of land with less documentation and less history. That's what men like him do." Rourke said, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. He was looking at her directly, the gray-green eyes, the face that had learned to say things clearly because it hadn't had practice with the alternatives. "Yes," she said, and then because they'd spent a winter learning to be honest with each other, "I don't know. Not yet. Ask me in a week." He nodded. "Rourke," she said. "Yes." "In the clearing, when Crane asked who I was." She paused. "You said your partner." "Yes." "Not your wife." "No," and she thought about that, about what he'd chosen, the specific word, what it held. "Why?" she said. He looked at the street for a moment. Because that's what you are, he said. That's what you've been since November. What you chose to be. He looked at her. Wife is what we called it in Belford's barn because it was the only word available. But what you actually are is what the mountain made you. She stood with that. The afternoon moved around them. People came and went. A dog near the farriers changed position to follow the sunlight. I need to see my father, she said. I know. Tonight, yes. She looked at him for a moment. Just looked. At this man who had been the weather outside her window for 5 years, which was how people in Crow Hollow had thought of him, and who had turned out to be something else entirely when encountered at closer range. Something more specific, more human, more worth knowing. I'll find you after, she said. He nodded. She went. Her father was at the cabin when she arrived, not drinking. She noticed that before she noticed anything else. The bottle was on the shelf where it always sat, but it wasn't in his hand, and his eyes were clear, and he'd lit the lamp even though it wasn't fully dark yet, which meant he'd been expecting her. He'd swept the floor. She noticed that too. She sat down at the table. He sat across from her. I did something, he said, without preamble. She waited. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and set it on the table between them and didn't look at it. Just at her. She looked down. It was a deed. Her name on it. Maren Voss. In the space where the property holder's name was written. The cabin, he said, and the half-acre around it. He cleared his throat. I sold the south field to pay the worst of the debts. What's left is the cabin and the yard. He looked at the deed. I signed it over to you. A lawyer in town did it proper. It's yours. She looked at the deed for a long time. Papa, you shouldn't have had to manage what you managed, he said. For years. You shouldn't have had to stand in that barn 8 times. You shouldn't have... His voice did something complicated. He steadied it. I know I wasn't what I should have been. I know I haven't been for a long time. He looked at his hands on the table. I can't take that back. I don't have what it would take to take it back. But this I can do. She looked at her father's hands. She remembered them when she was small. Carpenter's hands, sure and capable and warm. She remembered what they'd made the small shelf he'd built for her mother, the repairs around the house that used to happen before they stopped happening. These were still those hands, under everything, under all the years. You don't have to leave, she said. The cabin. He looked up. I'm not going to throw you out of the cabin, Papa. Her voice was even. That's not what this is. What is it? It's mine, she said simply. That's all. It's mine and I know it's mine. That matters even if the day-to-day doesn't change. He nodded slowly. The lamp burned between them. He's good to you, her father said. Eventually, she thought about Rourke, about the space he'd made on the first night at camp for her to help with the food without making a production of it, about the way he'd moved to match her pace on the slope without saying a word, about 4 words he'd said to her in the second week on the mountain. Good, you did right. 4 words that had sat in the part of her that had been waiting 25 years for someone to look at what she'd done with the information available to her and say yes. Correct. That's what that was. Yes, she said. He's good to me. Her father nodded again, like something had settled. She went to find Prue after. Prue was in her house 3 doors down from the dry goods store, which smelled like beeswax and dried lavender and the warmth of a home that had been a home for a long time. She opened the door before Maren knocked. I saw you come into town, she said. Saw you go into the territory office. How did you know I'd go there first? Because you're you. Prue stepped back to let her in. Come sit. I have something on the stove. They sat in Prue's kitchen with bowls of something that had been simmering all day, and the late afternoon came through the window, and the stove added its warmth to the room, and it was comfortable. Simply ordinarily comfortable. Maren realized she hadn't sat in ordinary comfort in months. How was it? Prue said. Long. She wrapped her hands around the bowl. And worth it. He treated you well on the mountain. He treated me like I said I was, and I proved I was. She paused, which is all I've ever wanted from anyone. Prue looked at her for a moment. And you came back, she said. I came back for the court. We'll go back up when the circuit review is done. And after that, when the spring is over and the summer, Marin looked at the bowl in her hands, at the steam rising off it. She let herself look at the after, the cabin in the hollow, the two nail stiles on the wall, the flat iron by the stove, and the snares in the east draw, in the blue of the sky above the timberline, on a clear day, which was a blue that didn't exist anywhere else she'd ever been. The list on the table. The man who had waited 2 minutes on that slope before saying, "All right." "I think I'm going back," she said. "Because I want to." Prue nodded, like that was the only answer that mattered. "Are you happy?" Prue asked. Marin thought about it. Not the reflex answer, the automatic answer. The real answer. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe, partly." She looked at Prue. "I'm living like it counts. I'm not pretending things are other than they are. I'm not standing in a room waiting to be chosen." She paused. "I'm doing the work I decided to do in the place I decided to be with a person I actually chose." She thought about that for a moment. "Is that happiness? I don't know. It might be something better." Prue was quiet. Then she said, "That's a better start than happiness." Marin looked at her. "Happiness can be luck," Prue said. "What you're describing is construction." She smiled. "That lasts." 3 weeks later, the circuit review closed. The Rourke claim was confirmed. The administrative records in Crane's file were referred to the governor. Aldous Crane's company in the days that followed quietly withdrew from 2 other territory acquisition efforts, which told Marin everything she needed to know about how thoroughly they'd lost. The official survey map of the Northridge properties was filed with the Territory Office in late April. Ren Aldrich filled in the name himself. She was standing at the counter when he wrote it. Rourke was beside her. Aldrich dipped the pen and wrote the name in the space for property designation, the formal name that would appear on every map, every document, every official record going forward. He wrote Voss Ridge, not Rourke Ridge. Voss Ridge. She looked at it. "That's the name on the partnership filing," Aldrich said, without looking up. "The one registered in November when the claim was updated to reflect both parties." He capped the ink. "It's the name on the document." She looked at Rourke. He looked at the map. Then he looked at her. He didn't say that should be different. He didn't say that's not right. He said nothing at all, which was his way of saying what he meant. She looked at her name on the map. She thought about the mirror in the back room of the cabin on Settlers Road, cracked down the middle, splitting her reflection into 2 slightly misaligned halves that never quite agreed on what they were showing her. She thought about 8 Novembers in Ferris Belford's barn and what they'd cost her and what they'd made of her. She thought about Clara's letter in her coat pocket, which was still there. She'd never taken it out. She thought about Rourke's voice in the dark on that first night by the fire. "You don't look at work like something that happened to you. You look at it like something you decided." She looked at the map, at the name written on it in ink that would dry and stay. Voss Ridge. She looked at her hands, at the scars and the calluses and the rope marks still fading on both palms, and the split on the right index finger that kept cracking in cold weather, and the general evidence of 25 years of deciding things. Witnesses, she thought. All of it. Witnesses to everything she'd done when no one was watching. For a long time. Until now.